Advancing the cause of liberty takes more than just coming up with ideas. It means making them happen. This is Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome, everybody. Episode 154 for a special celebration of Independence Day. If you're listening to this episode on the day it comes out, it is actually Independence Day, even though it's July 2nd. Some of you might be listening late on July 4th or later thinking that's what we're talking about. But no, we're specifically doing this episode on July 2nd and talking about Independence Day. You'll see why shortly. We are joined by none other than Kevin Gutzman, professor of history, Western Connecticut State University, author of a number of fantastic books, some of which we will link to on the show notes page, societyandthestate.com/154. Kevin, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here, Connor.
So Brian and I were talking about what we wanted to do, and there's this fun, I don't know what you call it, slogan that I came across online recently that said, "Treason is the reason for the season." And I just chuckled at that, and I've actually ordered a T-shirt from Julie Borowski. I think it's Liberty Tees is her company that has that slogan on it. I'm going to wear that every year now. So, but you're like the guy to talk to about this, right? Like, I want our listeners to understand, and I want us to talk about to what extent the founders and the revolution can be called treason. Do you think that that's kind of a fair label to assign to kind of the eventual result of what the founders did in revolting against the crown?
Well, if you're British, it certainly looked like treason because many of the people who were leaders in the American Revolution had sworn oaths of loyalty to King George III. On the other hand, if you accepted their understanding of what they were doing, it was King George III who had violated the social compact, and so actually they were only enforcing the agreement that they claimed to have had with the crown.
What social compact are you referring to? Add a little bit of color there. Okay,
well, if you take a look at the central argument about this from the Patriot side, Thomas Jefferson's 1774 pamphlet, A Summary View of the Rights of British America, what you find is that Jefferson says the people who settled the colonies in the first place did so in exercise of their natural right to emigrate, and then they established their own polities in North America, asking the British monarchs to be their monarchs too. So in other words, their contention was that they had a contractual relationship with the British crown and that King George had violated the terms of the agreement, and that meant that their obligations no longer bound them. So as far as they were concerned, it was true that there was duty of mutual loyalty, but it wasn't it was the king who had violated the agreement.
That's interesting.
That's how they would have gotten around the allegation that they were traitors.
And what I'm hearing,
from the British point of view.
Yeah, go ahead.
From the British point of view, this was all made up. There hadn't actually been any agreement between the colonists and the crown, and they were a bunch of traitors. So,
and what you had said earlier, I think, supports the view that treason, to some respects, is in the eye of the beholder, right?
That's correct. Well, at least there have been ingenious arguments to that effect, at least. I actually tend to sympathize with the British in this connection that, for example, when the first colonists went to Jamestown, they didn't do so with any agreement with the crown, that there would be certain conditions on which they would have to remain loyal. Mm-hmm. So it seems rather ingenious that they would have asserted that there had been any kind of binding conditions on the king at all. But that was what they said.
It also kind of connects to the idea, does it not, that under English law, like I'm fuzzy on this, so you may be able to help me out here, but isn't there like, the English Constitution isn't actually a written constitution. It's just kind of this, oral history and judicial precedent, whereas in America, it's a very written and concise document. Am I hitting the mark a little bit there, that they kind of have this like more tradition of just kind of not having things so concisely written and narrowly detailed, whereas in America that's different? Am I missing the mark?
Well, you're exactly right. And in fact, it was Americans who, during the Revolution, invented this idea of having written constitutions. The British Constitution still today is an unwritten constitution. There is no document. There were no quote-unquote founding fathers. They're just particular traditions, customs, habits, institutional arrangements that, taken together, the British refer to as their constitution. We might think of it as British political culture in general, but that's how they use the term. So this idea that you have a written document that somehow the populace agrees to live under, and that's the Constitution, that's the basis of the government. The first time that actually was implemented in the history of the world was with the Virginia Constitution of 1776.
Kevin, tell me a little bit about the way that those recently separated colonists, or I should say the recently separated states, who declared their independence, what was the attitude that they brought to the celebration of that independence versus the way that we celebrate it today? Do you see any glaring differences?
Well, certainly, because I think to a large degree nowadays we've kind of lost the political philosophy that they had in mind. So, for example, the central element of Jefferson's political science was what we call federalism, or the notion that the primary role in the political system is in the states, meaning the sovereign people of each state, and most of the power in the federal arrangement is reserved to the states. Nowadays, this is regarded as a reactionary idea, and people think they're freer if federal bureaucracies have a lot of decision-making authority, which, of course, is exactly opposite what Jefferson thought about this. So, when you hear the expression no taxation without representation, that wasn't just about taxes. That was a general claim that people wanted to be governed not by an unaccountable parliament in Britain, but by their own elected representatives, whether they were in New York or Philadelphia or Hartford or wherever they might be.
So, Kevin, we celebrate Independence Day, maybe to Brian's point, the average guy on the street, they don't call it Independence Day. What do they call it?
It's the 4th of July.
It's right, exactly. It's I'm going to celebrate the 4th, or what are you doing on the 4th? And it's like calling Christmas the 25th of December. In fact, a few years ago, I started this little protest for fun. I was wishing people a Merry 25th of December to you, to kind of make the point. And so we've kind of lost even the name of it. But Kevin, am I correct in remembering that it actually shouldn't be July 4th, right? July 2nd is kind of the more historically accurate day. What happened on July 2nd, or why the kind of disconnect or difference between the 2nd and the 4th?
Well, there actually is a really amusing letter from the founding period. It's from one of the Massachusetts delegates in the Continental Congress, John Adams, to his wife Abigail, who was an unusual woman for her time. She was well educated. She paid close attention to political events. She was really a confidant of the congressman. And so John Adams had been involved in drafting a Declaration of Independence. And then the day that the Congress agreed to it, he wrote his wife, and he said, "Hereafter, this is going to be the great annual festival. There are going to be fireworks. There are going to be celebrations. There will be parades. People will remember this is the great epocha in American history, the 2nd of July." And, of course, what had happened that day was that the Congress had agreed to it, but they hadn't decided to promulgate it yet. That came 2 days later. So this is why we think of Independence Day as being the 4th of July.
Mm. Talk to me, Kevin, about what was going through the mind of those who signed the document. Give our listeners a little bit of a sense of the gravity of the situation. I think, at a high level, we all understand what was going on and so forth. But when they sign, at the bottom of the Declaration of Independence, which I think too few of us read. I mean, if nothing else on the quote-unquote 4th of July, we should at least take the time, I think, to read the Declaration and see what they were saying. But there at the end, they're talking about appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, right? That we say that we ought to be free in independent states, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor. Give us a little bit of a better understanding of what was going through their minds. What were they feeling as they were signing this? What was the gravity and the implication of what they were daring to do?
Well, before I do that, just let me say, for listeners who've never read the Declaration of Independence or haven't read it in a long time, it's far more effective if you read it out loud. So find yourself a quiet room in your house, or maybe take a walk with it in your hand and read it to yourself. This is how it was expected to be encountered by people. In fact, we have an early copy of the Declaration of Independence with Thomas Jefferson's breath marks on it. And the reason he did that was to remind himself which parts to stress when it was read aloud.
Wow.
And you'll see that if you read it aloud, you're going to be impressed with a different part of it than the one we always think of when we think of what the Declaration of Independence says. It's not the philosophical predicate that is going to be most striking to you. It's going to be the longest part of it, which is the list of allegations against King George, what he had done that was justifying them in taking this momentous step. But what was going on at the time that the Congress was considering this was that there was a gigantic war. It was raging up and down the east coast of North America. And in fact, the American Revolution was fought in all the states. In fact, the town where my college is located was burned down by the British Army, Danbury, Connecticut, in the Revolution. So if you travel in New England, you'll see town greens and old Congregationalist meeting houses that used to be where the town meetings were held as well, and not in Danbury because the British burned it down. So Danbury is just kind of a hodgepodge of buildings here and there. It doesn't have a central square like other Connecticut towns or other New England towns. And in fact, of course, not only was there significant physical destruction, but there was gigantic economic displacement, because one of the first things the British did when the war started was to blockade the entire coast of these colonies, which were overwhelmingly agricultural, meaning that they were highly dependent on export markets. So it was a gigantic economic disaster for people who lived in 13 colonies. And the death toll from the American Revolution remains the highest proportionally of any American war.
Wow.
People encountered the British Army, and as I said, in every state, there were lengthy occupations of all the major cities: Boston, Philadelphia, New York. The British Army came in, they arrested scores of hundreds of the leading patriots and put them in prison ships, which were ships in which people were kept without really any sanitary accommodation being made for them. So it was very common that if you were put in a prison ship, you died from some kind of nasty disease we now associate with less developed countries. And it was just awful. Beside which, you knew that if you subscribed to that document, you were putting your life on the line. There was actually one instance in which a couple of congressmen were shouting at each other one day in the Continental Congress, and Benjamin Franklin, who was the oldest member of the Congress, sat silently and listened to them for a while. And then when there was a pause and they both stopped to catch their breath, Franklin said, "Gentlemen, remember, we must all hang together, or we will surely all hang separately." And in fact, some of the people who signed did have all of their property destroyed. One fellow's wife and kids were put under arrest for years. People were hanged. You were literally putting your life on the line. You were pledging to each other your life. And I don't know how you could really stress this enough. They were really risking everything. But the idea was that the British just had decided they weren't going to let these colonists be British. They weren't going to let them have what were called the rights of Englishmen, the right to be taxed only with your own consent, the right to be tried before a jury before being sentenced to criminal punishment, and other basic rights that the English had taken for granted for hundreds of years. All of these were seen as being at the whim of the British political establishment by people in Britain. So the colonists thought, well, we really have no alternative in this, and posterity will remember us for taking this step for them, even though it's so horrible for us at the moment, which it really was. It's hard to exaggerate.
Kevin, as you spell out what they were putting on the line, to undertake this effort to separate themselves from Britain, I'm thinking to myself, I can't think of a single political leader, and I mean from the local level on up to the top of the federal level, that would be willing to do so today. What was the moral truth that the leaders of that time understood that we seem to be missing today?
Well, I think there are several things. One is that it was very common in their rhetoric to mention posterity. We don't now often hear reference to posterity. People are usually asking how I can get mine at the moment, or who's going to pay for what I'm entitled to. And the revolutionary generation decided it would go through what it knew was going to be just a wrenchingly awful experience, because the alternative was to have posterity suffer in this new state that the British evidently had in store for us. So that's one thing. Another thing is that people had the idea that, well, it might be that the community is more important than me as an individual, or it might be that I as an individual should weigh the community's concerns along with my own. And if you've been paying attention even to the incipient political season we're in now, you see that nobody's saying anything like this, right? So it's all about vote for me because I'll take from those other people and give it to you. And there really wasn't any of that kind of rhetoric at all in the American Revolution. In fact, it's almost as if people who lived in the 1770s and 80s in the United States were in a foreign country from us. So another thing is, of course, that there's frequent invocation of God's superintendence of things that are happening in the North American colonies, and of the prospects of people who live here if they undertake this cause with posterity in mind, that God will vindicate the right, and we think we understand that we're in the right. And so this is one reason why we have to hazard this. We don't really have an alternative. He expects us to defend our posterity's estate. So again, I think people who spend any time reading public sermons or public speeches or public pronouncements from the Congress or debates in the Continental Congress, pamphlets from the era, are going to see it really just is so different. It's almost, again, as if it were foreign.
Kevin, final question as we wrap things up. As you pointed out, reading the Declaration of Independence out loud, you're going to find that so much of its content is an articulation of grievances, an airing of grievances, almost like the modern Rand Paul Festivus annual airing of grievances that is engaged in. Give us your thought on then versus now. As we look back in 2019, living under the national, federal, central government that we currently do, what is your thought as you look back and see the basis for their separation from this government based on a list of reasons? Give our listeners a sense of like maybe what those were, and do you think they are analogous? Do you think that we've kind of gone far past them, or what are your observations on 1776 versus 2019 in terms of grievances against the government and as the basis for opposition, revolution, and what have you?
Well, I think the form of the American political system today is much at variance with the one that people fought the revolution for. That is, getting back to one of the principles I mentioned earlier in our conversation, for somebody like Thomas Jefferson, say, the idea of federalism, that if we're going to have a federal relationship with the other states, the system ought to be highly decentralized. This is lost on both of the main political parties today. So you anticipate that you'll have new regulations from federal bureaucracies, in the making of which nobody who's been elected will have had any role at all, right? That is completely unlike what the American Revolution was about. People are familiar from their earliest elementary school days with the slogan, "No taxation without representation." But that didn't mean simply, I want to have 12 people in some distant city make my taxes, and people in my 4-state region will get to choose one of those 12 people. That was really about having your town meeting or having your county's voters get together and choose people who are going to go to your colonial, now state capital, and make your most important laws for you. You are going to have a real say in the policy making. This is the main thing that the revolution was fought for. And again, I think it's almost absent from most of the important policy making in American life today. Yes, it's true that in virtually all the states, you can be involved in choosing your local public high school's principal or in setting your town's property tax rate. But when it comes to the really important questions, those are handled in D.C. and often by unelected bureaucrats who've never had anybody who's had any connection to the citizenry tell them what to do at all. So you can tell that I think this is lamentable, but this is the way that our system has mutated since the revolution ended.
Definitely food for thought today and frankly every day, but certainly when treason is the reason for the season, we ought to be reading the Declaration of Independence, pondering how far adrift we've gone and what potentially we can try and do about it. Kevin Gutzman is professor of history, Western Connecticut State University, author of some phenomenal books. Again, we will link to those, which I highly recommend and have enjoyed. societyandthestate.com/154. If you want to learn more about that founding era and some of the folks involved, definitely get one of Kevin's books. Check out the link. And Kevin, thanks for joining us, and happy 2nd of July.
I was happy to do it. Same to you.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.